This is the Wandering Mike.
Welcome, everyone, to the Wandering Mike. Today I'm here with Jesse. Hey, Jesse, how you doing?
Great, thanks. How's it going?
Pretty good. It's been a nice day so far, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. I think it's going to be a very interesting one. Um, so, yeah, Jesse, to get us started, if you just want to tell us a little bit about yourself, your life, your journey, anything you want to share to start us off.
Sure. My name is Jesse. I am from Manhattan, New York, in the States. I grew up in Manhattan, lived in Manhattan most of my life. I moved to Brooklyn around 2008, and I lived in Brooklyn for about a decade and bounced around all parts of the city. And I just recently moved out of the city about a year and a half ago for the first time. So I am newly out of New York, which is an adventure. I work in education. I own and direct a tutoring company, and I work with kids. I've been doing that for a little over 20 years. I also have a bit of a history as a writer and as a musician. I was a hip hop artist for a bit in the city, and yeah, looking forward to chopping it up, having a good conversation.
Yeah. So there was a lot of interesting things in there that I would love to talk about more. Um, People that know me personally and also people that listen to the podcast know that I'm a huge fan of hip hop as well myself. So I definitely want to talk to you about that as well. Um, so maybe to take it chronologically. Growing up in New York, and you mentioned the tutoring company that you had for 20 plus years. So, um, what was the journey of motivation there? Like, how did the journey into that field develop?
Right, great question. So both of my parents were teachers, and I grew up seeing education, obviously as a participant myself in school, but also seeing it on the other side by being up front and center to the life of
Mm,
teachers. My dad passed away when I was about 10. And so my mom, in order to be home more with me and my little sister, began tutoring out of our dining room. And that was an opportunity for me to see not only what it's like for one-on-one education to happen, but also to kind of see a bit of entrepreneurship. Although my
mm,
mom didn't intend to start a business or be part of a new industry or anything, this was in the early 1990s. Tutoring wasn't really a thing yet. And she managed to put together a business and a career and a pursuit and kept the ship afloat for us as a family. And students, kids, children were just kind of coming through the house. Saturdays, Sundays after school, my mom was tutoring kids in our apartment. So when I graduated from college with a degree in philosophy and television production, also known as nothing, I quickly got roped into my mom's tutoring world. She had a student who was working on something that my mom didn't know how to do, so she asked me to help out. I worked with that kid. That kid told their friend about me. Their friend told the neighbor told a cousin, and suddenly I had a job. I certainly didn't intend to go into education. I had no formal training or schooling in education, but I've worked with young people my entire life, starting with my little sister. But I was a peer leader in school. I was a camp counselor all throughout my teenage years, ended my early 20s every summer. And so working with kids was always a passion of mine. And I didn't like school. So helping kids to have perhaps a different experience in the classroom and outside of it was something I was interested in. And I really enjoyed the freedom of the profession. I loved working one on one with kids. And this was at a time when I was a young guy in the city and bouncing around from neighborhood to neighborhood, house to house. I was going to these kids' houses and working with them. It was really exciting. And it was a fun way for me to get started as a functioning adult with a job. And then it kind of just kind of organically grew from there. My mother and I acquired too many students for the two of us to carry on our own. So we started hiring people, and that meant that I had to formalize our curricula and train the staff and make a website. And then it became an LLC. And before I knew it, I owned a business. I certainly didn't plan to do that either. And that's still something that I'm figuring out as I go. But the experience of working with kids, working with their families, working alongside my mother, being a part of New York City and contributing to the educational landscape, was something that I really enjoyed in my 20s and 30s. And we pivoted to an online model the last 5 years. So now I have the opportunity to work with kids, not just in the city, but all throughout the land. And it continues to be a journey and an adventure that I greatly enjoy.
Right. Um, so for me, to better understand, because it sounded a little bit, because you said you weren't a big fan of school, and it's also not a secret to a lot of people that I'm not the biggest fan of the education system in general. And um, so you were kind of talking about a curriculum for your tutoring company. So are you trying to also like make the content of what people learn a little bit better, more tailored, or is it basically, because I mean people still are in school, I reckon, so you have to kind of adhere with what is wanted in the education system, right?
Right. Yeah. That's a good question. So it's a pretty broad spectrum. Sometimes families come to us and they say, our kid needs help with what's going on in the classroom. So then the tutor or me, we're going to look at what's happening in the classroom. We want to know what's the assignment, when's the next test, what's
Right.
happening with the actual kid in their school. Other times, parents will say, we don't like our school's math program or writing program, or the school doesn't offer critical thinking coaching. We
Yeah.
want you to make your own curriculum and walk our kid through a plan of your own devising. And so we do that. And everything in between. Often there's a hybrid approach where sometimes if the kid needs help with what's going on in the classroom, we'll do that. And then if we show up on a Wednesday at 4:30 and the kid's like, "Yeah, I'm good. Like my English class that you're usually here to help me with, we don't have any assignments this week." Well, I'm not just gonna be like, "Okay, bye." I'm gonna dig into my bag of tricks. And we have a plethora of options that we can provide in those moments to make sure that we're still piggybacking off of what is being led in the classroom or whatever main idea we've been working on with the student at the time. But we will do it in our way, which is still going to be conducive to the same skill set that they're working on in school. We're not going to contradict or conflict with what they're working on in the classroom. The last thing we ever want to do is confuse a kid and be like, we know that the teacher is telling you this, but here's what's really
Right.
true. We want to be on the same page. But the goal is to make it as broad as possible, make sure that the student is receiving a breadth of comprehensive enrichment ideas. And use the word tailored. We have the opportunity to really be one on one. So we can make sure that we're customizing everything to the individual who's directly in front of us in terms of their educational needs, in terms of filling in whatever gaps there might be, in terms of if they're ambitious, we can help them get ahead in terms of meeting their interests. We can make sure that we're catering the lessons to what they're into, to their personalities, to their passions, whatever it might be. So we do have some boilerplate curricula for various subjects and various disciplines, but the whole idea is to be flexible and be malleable and make sure that we're catering everything that we do to fit the needs of the kid who's right in front of us. And being highly attuned to what the student presents in the moment is a vital feature of our work. So I train my staff really carefully to make sure that they're paying attention to the signs and the ideas that the kids are giving off, because just because you meet a kid and you get to know them doesn't mean that every week they're going to be the same. We have to be flexible and make
Right.
sure that we can pivot if we need to meet the kids' needs in the moment and not just say, "Hey, I'm this was my plan for the day, so this is what we're doing." We're not going to be like that. We're going to really be in this symbiotic dance with them and recognize, okay, you're providing me with this, then we're going to do this. If you're providing me with that, then we're going to do that. But it's all based on a few formulaic ideas that we do have ironed out pretty well for various subjects.
Yeah. I actually pretty recently had this conversation again with someone. Um, because in my professional life, for I'm not working there anymore, but I did work for 3.5 years as a trainer in a contact center. So I was basically training people coming in on the software to use, on soft skills needed for customer service. Um, so you could say in a way, it was like a teaching profession in a way. And I was talking with someone else. She was a preschool teacher, and we kind of said, yeah, like teaching, tutoring, like it's one of those jobs, even if you did it for years, you can't really run it on autopilot because you always need to be focused. Like, it's not like, oh, I've put on this machine like all my life. No, but it's a human being. So you need to be able to always react to get like the most efficient approach.
Yeah, I would agree. The rapport is paramount. And so the student has to feel that you're engaged with them in the moment. And even if you're working on something that you've done 1,000 times, well, you haven't done it with this kid. So it's going to be a little bit
Yeah.
different. And the idea that the kid brings into the room, that's the idea we really need to cater to. So there are many sentences that I say over and over. There are many jokes that I've been telling for 20 years.
Mm.
There's a lot of material and content that I might repeat, but I'm going to make sure that I tweak it, that it lands for this particular kid. It's comparable to being a stand-up comic. You have your routines, you have your bits, and you've refined them, and they're tried and true over the years. But you still have to read the room, and just because the bit worked with this audience yesterday doesn't mean it's going to work with this particular audience today. And you might have to tweak a little bit based on what you see from that audience. And I have the privilege of my audience being one person, so I can really tailor it to make sure it lands for that one kid. And the goal is to make sure that not only I'm unlike stand up comedy, I'm not trying to entertain exclusively. I really want to try to engage and challenge them. And so various levels are going to be apparent. Different kids are going to be in different places. So although there is a plan that I have for all subjects and all concepts, it's going to be revised moment to moment. And you're right, autopilot is not a thing for us. We have to be leaning in, eyes open, ears open, paying attention to what we see if we want to do our job well.
Yeah. Um, I really feel like, and obviously, this can't be, and I think isn't intended to be like a whole alternative education, which would span way too far. But I feel like you are very well equipped to run a tutoring business and basically aiding people in their education and also maybe more generally speaking in their lives, because that's basically what we educate children for, right? Is to later on be able to function in society. So, you having studied philosophy, I feel like you really have, because you mentioned critical thinking before as well. So, I feel like you really have an understanding of, well, just what education should kind of teach in terms of skills as well, like life skills.
I appreciate you saying so. Yeah, there's a lot of interdisciplinary work that goes on. Even though parents don't call me up and say, I'd like you to intertwine your philosophy background and perhaps throw some interdisciplinary ideas about sociology and also be attuned to the developmental requirements of my child. No, they call me and they
Right.
go, he's bad at math. I'm like, all
Yeah.
right. And so I have to follow that path. And it's up to me to really make the most of it. So the notion of understanding a little bit of child psychology, understanding development, knowing about human nature in general, understanding kids in particular, uh, because they're a different breed than the adults that we interact with day to day.
Mm.
And also having an understanding of what it means to be taught, not just what it means to teach. I like to really be able to empathize with these students from moment to moment and see what it's like on the receiving end of this. They've dealt with a whole day of school. They've dealt with their parents. They've dealt with their friends. They've dealt with the stress of being a teenager or a middle school student or whatever it might be. Then they sit down and they have to deal with me now. Am I going to be just another annoyance and another authority figure, another person giving them tasks and making them stressed and making them confused and making them feel bad about themselves? Or am I going to be able to alleviate all of that and hopefully provide them with something that is still challenging and still pushes them and still encourages them to put forth some effort and to learn something new and be a bit uncomfortable in that learning process, but still feel connected to something positive and meaningful and make sure that they're being seen in the moment? Because there's a lot of opportunities for you to miss kids. And I really try to make sure that they're being seen as often as I can.
Right. And the other thing that um, is obviously very well, not unique, but it is part of your journey, is that creative side. You mentioned like your adventures in, I'm just going to call them adventures. I didn't think of a better word.
They certainly
In,
were.
in the hip hop culture, in writing, and as you just briefly hinted at, stand up comedy as well. Um, so, do you feel like that also just gives you a better understanding in a way? Because I feel like, especially in an education and school um, setting, well, actually, to be fair, in the United States, maybe even a little bit better than in Germany, where I am originally from. Um, I feel like you guys do quite of a good job to offer extracurricular activities like that. But at the end of the day, especially when we talk about tests and things that are relevant for people to go to college and stuff like that, I feel like creativity isn't really encouraged that highly. So you having that life of creativity and knowing its benefits as well, do you feel like that um helps you as well?
Probably. It's an interesting question. So the good news is, although schools and sometimes parents and teachers might not emphasize the arts as much as they do kind of the more hard academic subjects, kids are still into them. And so
Right.
I don't have to reach too deeply to get a kid interested in something that's beyond the academia. The And every kid is different. And to be honest, in terms of like what goes on in the states educationally, there's a lot of variety. So it's a big country. Things happen very differently from one place to another place. Even within New York City itself, from school to school, you're going to
Mm.
see a really different experience for different kids. But from my perspective, being able to recognize that it's a human experience what a student is going through. They're not just a student. They're not just there to learn a subject. They're a person with lots of stuff going on. And odds are, whatever the subject is that I'm trying to teach them, that's not the most important thing in their mind, in the moment or in general. So my goal is to reach that kid and figure out what makes them tick. What are they passionate about? What do they love? And it's possible they love biology. Maybe they love algebra. They could love essay writing. That's quite possible. And then that's kind of a direct line into academia. But if they love ice hockey, if they love dance, if they love penguins, okay, we're going to go through that lens and make sure that they recognize it. If they're capable of being passionate about any topic, they can often funnel those feelings towards whatever subject it might be and use it to their advantage as a student. And when I say student, I don't even mean in terms of getting good grades. I mean in terms of being a capable learner. Because a lot of times what I'll end up doing is aiming to help these kids not just get good grades, but to really become more capable learners. So the notion of what makes a person able to learn, very often it doesn't have to do just with the nuts and bolts of the topic. It has to do with drive and incentive, a lot of executive functioning skills. There's plenty there that they could attribute to their interest in penguins that can also go towards something like science or math.
Um, that's actually a super interesting point because um, I feel like that is something that maybe also isn't emphasized enough in a school in a school setting is the actual um, art or skill of learning.
Mhm.
Because obviously you can, okay, we're gonna have a test next week on, no, the Gettysburg Address. So you just learn the Gettysburg Address from start to finish for a week. You can answer every single question about it. And in 2 weeks, you don't know, like, you don't even remember the beginning. Was it for school? How does it start? And, um, so yeah, that's not learning, is it? Like, memorizing, as it is often portrayed, isn't an effective way to learn things for the long term, to really internalize them.
Yeah, it's true. Because there's plenty of things that we learn that don't happen in school, and most of that is unintentional. So learning very often just happens through experience. It happens because we care about something. Our brains aren't designed to do well on tests. Our brains are designed to help us function and survive. And so our brains are usually going to retain information that happens during a moment that matters to us. And if our brain is aware that something important is happening, it's going to light up, it's going to pay attention, and the hippocampus of our brain is going to remember it. But if our brain thinks, hey, this doesn't matter, it's less
Yeah.
likely to remember it. And unfortunately, in school, the way that most kids get alerted that something matters is if there's a scary grade attached to it, if there's a
Mm.
consequence, if there's pressure, if there's fear. And so that fight or flight kicks in. And so kids end up doing quote unquote well in school as long as there's something scary that's pushing them to pay attention and to remember. But that's not what I like to use as incentive. I don't want to just pressure or scare kids into doing quote unquote well. Because, like you said, just because you get a good grade on a test doesn't mean you actually learned anything. You just
Yeah.
acquired that grade through whatever means, and good for you. What'd you actually get out of it? And even if you don't, even if you do retain that information, what skills did you gain? What's the point of memorizing any speech or any idea if you don't know what it connects to? What's the context? What use is it to have it in your head? The notion of meaning is a really important one for us. We want to make sure that kids aren't just learning, but they understand why they're learning. These are children who are intended to be guided towards some functional adult capabilities, and so they're in a room in a school 5 days a week, 8 hours a day for the first 18, 22 years of their lives, doing what? Memorizing stuff, spitting stuff out to get a good grade. Like, why? The goal would really be for them to understand that there's a purpose behind not just the content, but also the skills that are connected to this. And learning is a skill, effort is a skill, time management is a skill, willpower, being able to persevere through moments of insecurity, failing, and then still continuing to try. These are things that some people are better at naturally than others, but you certainly can progress. And ideally, school would be an environment in which you can continue to get better at those things, not just memorize stuff.
Yes. I totally agree with everything you said. And yet another idea that just came to my mind from um, the conversation that I had with this preschool teacher um, is, well, like you've said, it is really important to understand why am I doing these things and just attaining skills for yourself. Because what we also discovered as quite a challenge for people coming out of school or even university is that finding of their own purpose. Because in school, you always have someone, like you said, you have negative consequences to fear, and basically just have someone who schedules the day for you that basically tells you this is what's happening today. Maybe sometimes with a reasoning, a lot of times without. And then once you're out of this environment, you're all of a sudden you're here. Well, I can do whatever I want, which can be a freeing feeling, but it can also be a very scary feeling if you don't know
Mm.
what to do with that time. So, um, how, how do you address that, or in your opinion, how do you feel like you can nurture that that aspect of it.
Right. So the phrase that kids hear a lot is, well, you're going to need this when you go into the real world, or you can't act like this when you get into the real world. And I question that because for a kid, guess what? They're in the real world. They're not in some fictional world. This is the world. They're in it. It's happening. To an adult can look at a kid and be like, you're not even in the real world. I pack your lunch. I tell you what to do. You don't have to pay for anything. Like your world is fake.
Mm,
Sorry. No, to the kid, they're in it. So, what I really like highlighting for students is them recognizing what they're doing now is most likely going to be what they do when they're older. The way that they're functioning now, odds are they're building habits that are going to get reinforced over and over and over again unless they change. So, the teacher's job is to provide them with opportunities to recognize the ways that they can change, give them exercises and ways to build those skills so that they can be as functional and as positive members of society as possible. Socially, a lot goes into this as well. For their own personal development, in terms of understanding their identity, in terms of learning about themselves as they go. These are vital features of the student's experience, also. But I want the kid to recognize that it's not like the real world's gonna start later for them, and it's just gonna be like they flip a switch, and suddenly they're gonna be a functioning adult, and like, "Oh, well, now that I'm 22, I'm capable of, showing up at my friend's house on time, and planning a trip, and knowing how to do my taxes, and understanding how to get a roommate, and I can just do all those things because now I'm in the real world." Like, sorry, if you can't tie your shoes and you don't know your mom's cell phone number when you're 15, you're not gonna be able to do it later unless something changes. So I love providing students with the ability to recognize you learn how to learn. And if you're good at learning, that's the best skill you can have because that's a lifelong pursuit. You're always going to need to be learning. I'm a new dad, and I didn't realize how vital being a supple learner was for a new parent. Every hour of every day, I had to learn something new. I had to pivot. I had to adjust. I had to change. The kid was adjusting and changing. So what I thought I knew, all of a sudden I didn't know anymore. And if I didn't enjoy learning, I would have been screwed. And I'm sure that's what happens to many parents and many adults in general, because the notion of, I don't understand this. I don't know how to do this. I'm bad at this. Well, now what? The only answer to that is, well, learn. We got to learn how to improve, how to do it better. And if we don't have the confidence in ourselves to, first of all, be okay with the fact that there's a moment that I don't know how to do something, and then the second part, which is I can improve, that's the learning part, life is going to be tricky. So I want students to know that the real world, they're in it and they're able to mold themselves in this moment that's going to contribute to their happiness and their success and their ability to function in the future.
yeah, there were some beautiful and important things in what you just said, um, which yeah, I just want to highlight again, which was confidence being a big one. And also, obviously, the willingness to keep learning. And again, I don't want to make this a whole thing about the education system, but
Sure.
that that's the because for me personally, if I can just talk about myself,
Please.
um, that was always one thing. For me, I feel like I just understood learning wrong a long, long time because of the way that it was portrayed in school. I was relatively quick in picking up facts by just listening. So being present in the classroom and actually taking notes and listening to it often was enough for me to get like good to very good grades. So I didn't spend a lot of time outside of the classroom actually relearning these things. And so for me, learning something in your free time was something that I kind of didn't do because I didn't deem it necessary. But I just very like maybe 25 years of age or older, I understood, well, but learning is such a beautiful thing if it is things that I'm interested about. It's like I started to read philosophical books. I started to look more into history, which was a subject I hated in school because I was like, why do I need to memorize all these facts? But now I'm like, oh, this explains so much of the world we live in right now. This is so interesting how things developed. And I found my own um, kind of enjoyment in learning these things. But yeah, for me, I feel like it started later than it maybe could have, just because feel like I was disencouraged from doing it from the way it was presented to me in school.
Yeah, unfortunately, schools aren't really set up to be enjoyable. And we take it for granted. We accept it as an axiomatic fact that school sucks. And when you ask a kid, like, how do you like school? We don't expect the answer to be, oh, I really enjoy it. We expect it to be, I don't like it. And we're like, of course. Why? Why is that the default that we just accept? It doesn't have to be bad. And I think that you're hitting it right on the head that when you're provided with the proper context and the right circumstances, it can be really fascinating what goes on in a book. Even if it's a textbook, even if it's a dense 2,000-year-old textbook, it can still really resonate and make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up because it's inspiring. And yet the system that we put a lot of kids through can quite naturally and easily remove the magic from the content and the relevance of a lot of these lessons. I was similar to you. I found history to be really annoying. There's a lot of work that I had zero interest in. And the school's really presented as grades are what matter. And as long as you can figure out a way to get those grades, you've done your job. And I talk to parents about this quite often. I'll ask them, what's the point of school? And they'll think hard. They want to get the answer right. And they'll come up with a lot of answers that are often very impressive. But the word learning is usually like seventh or eighth on the list. And they forget that that's the deal. We're putting kids in these rooms with these educators so that the young people will learn stuff. And yet that doesn't seem to be on the forefront of most people's minds. Students, they'll never say the word. They'll come up with 100 reasons why they're in school and learning. They don't even realize that that's part of what's supposed to be happening. So I think it's a complicated situation. Because like I said, in the States, at least, there's many different school systems and there's a lot of different ways that education's happening. So it's hard to kind of gauge and just put your finger on good or bad, up or down across the board.
Mhm.
But overall, it's a pretty antiquated system, especially considering how quickly technology has been changing, society as a whole, the way that young people think, the way that the job market has shifted. We're working with a really obsolete manual here. And
Mm.
consequently, the kids are going through a process that was crafted and intended for a different time period with a different population, with different intentions and different goals, and with a different outcome in mind. It's a factory-based system. Um, you ask a kid 30 years ago, what do you want to be? Very often it was some sort of an adventurous, pioneering profession they might have in mind because they wanted to be out in the world. They wanted to be astronauts, or they wanted to be explorers, or they wanted to be professional athletes, or they wanted, if they wanted to be professionals, being a doctor or a lawyer. These are all things that I think a lot of kids wanted to be a movie star, even, or a performer of some kind. Um, Nowadays, they want to be YouTubers.
Mm.
They want to be influencers. They want to be online making content. And I don't knock the kids for that. I knock the system in which they're being raised for not providing them with some sort of a path that's a little bit more substantive, that provides them with an interest that connects to the world around them in a more meaningful way, other than jumping on their phone and saying, "Hey guys," and then talking about something most likely quite vapid. The kids are going to be into whatever lights them up. And here we are in society in 2025. What lights them up is dopamine hits and screens and clicks. And that's fair, but there's so much more to the world that really could be engaging them. And it's up to the adults to provide them with a reason to care about it, and also the space to care about it in a way that isn't so pressure filled and grades oriented and scary, which is hard to do, by the way. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not blaming teachers and the notion of working with the school system where the kids they really range in the wide varieties that they do. It is hard to present a curriculum that checks all the boxes and also engages the kids and gets them ready for this ever-changing world. You can make a curriculum for 2025 if you want. By 2030, the world's gonna be a different place. So I hope you had a good time making that curriculum. You gotta change it now. I'm not saying this is something that I could do. I think it's an incredibly difficult task to create an educational system for a nation or a state or a city or a school that works for everybody. But I do believe that the interest of the child is really to learn and to be seen, and those are things that I think could be prioritized more.
Yes, I feel like you've said it perfectly, and that's basically what I always say as well. It's like I know what I'm thinking of here and what I would want the education system to be is very close to impossible just because um, of everything that is involved. It's a whole nation. It's so many people, and I feel like from talking with you, I kind of feel like you agree. Like the best thing um, would be to really tailor the curriculum to every single student. But obviously, that isn't possible. We can't analyze someone for a couple of weeks and then go, okay, so for you, we're gonna this and this and this. It just actually isn't feasible. Um, but yeah, and it is complicated. So all we
But
can
what could
do is
happen is that the training that prospective teachers go through could be more oriented around being able to read the kids, and being attuned to the
right.
kids and being flexible. I don't know what it actually entails. Again, I'm sure that there's a wide variety of how teachers get trained. Um, I have a lot of respect for classroom teachers and sympathy for classroom teachers because their jobs are incredibly difficult and they are underappreciated as a profession.
Yes.
So when I think about the educational system, I don't want to leave teachers under the bus. It's really the training of teachers that I think ought to be modified, if anything. The goal in my mind would be to almost train them to be performers and to be able to read the room the way that any seasoned performer can, and teach them how to shift if needed, how to retain the attention of a kid. But it's so difficult because you're not just dealing with the educational level and the particular content interests of a kid. You're also dealing with behavioral issues. You're dealing with different interests that the students have from time to time. There's so much that goes into being a classroom teacher that is beyond what I have to deal with a kid because I just have one student in front of me. It must
Yeah.
be incredibly difficult. And I remember being a student myself. I didn't make my teachers' lives easy. I was incorrigible, and that's a quote because my teacher told me I was. I that's how I learned that word. The idea of being a student who cares about anything other than their own personal enjoyment in the moment, it's not likely to happen. Kids are going to do what they want usually. Um, and it's a tough job for a teacher to make what the kid wants to do is be quiet, pay attention, and learn. But optimally, that would be the goal.
Yeah. Um, I really enjoy talking about education. I feel like it's a really good conversation that we're having right now. I will take your mentioning of a performer though to just selfishly put the topic into hip hop for a bit because especially in New York, I'm just really, really interested in how how that was, how the experience for you was to start a hip hop career in one of these cities that maybe apart from LA has like this very rich hip hop culture. Um, so Yeah, maybe just take us through your experience. How did you get started? How was it? Yeah, sure.
Sure.
Just
And I appreciate your interest. So I grew up in the early 80s in New York City, and hip hop was what I knew. I played a lot of basketball and I hung out with a lot of kids in my neighborhood. And so hip hop was kind of being born while I was being raised. So graffiti and breakdancing and rap music was around me in a very natural way. Rap music was what I listened to as a child. I wasn't really all that familiar with James Taylor, Bob Dylan, or the Beatles. I knew about Run DMC, LL Cool J, the Beastie Boys, and Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson was the only non-rapper that I
right.
was into as a kid. Um, but New York City was my playground and my school in a lot of ways. And so I got molded into this world of hip hop really naturally. I also liked language from a young age, and
Mm,
I was really into rhyming poetry and puns. I really had a strong appreciation for that. So once I understood that a lot of hip hop lyricism was essentially poetry with a lot of wordplay, just put to a beat and put to a rhythm, my appreciation for it was very natural. And I started rapping when I was a kid, just in my house. There's a lot of tapes of me rapping, some videotapes, some audio tapes. When I'm 7 years old, 8 years old, 9 years old, making up my own songs, a lot of different versions of popular songs. Run DMC, their song "It's Tricky." I made my own version of "It's Tricky." A lot of Beastie Boys songs, I would make my own little versions of parodies, basically. But it was just for fun. And then when I was like 13, 14, 15 years old, you go to these clubs in New York City, people are rapping who aren't rappers. They're just people. It's not like I had to go to some, Radio City Music Hall or Madison Square Garden. We're going to little clubs and there's just dudes rapping on the street when you're waiting online. And I was like, "Oh, this is just a thing that people do. I could be one of those people." And then some of my friends got into it and I got into it. So it was very much so a hobby and just kind of a passion and a joy that we started just doing in school. We did it on the bus. It was just kind of fun. And then when I was in college, this guy Eminem came out. Actually, Eminem came
right.
out when I was in high school, but he got quite large when I was in college. And so I
Mm,
was like, okay, not only is this something that I could do, look at this like scrawny little white kid running around taking over the world through rap. I was like, all right, let me actually try. So, put together a group and when I was in college, and we played a bunch of local shows, on campus and stuff. And then during the summers, in between semesters, I was back in New York City off campus, and me and my friends, we got picked up by this little label, called Imagine That. This was in 2002, and they brought us around different showcases. I was very ambitious. Um, I was very interested in showing off some lyrical skills that I had been really honing and practicing on my own for so many years just for fun. But all of a sudden I had an audience that I was just put in front of and I was like, cool, this will be fun. And I really took to it. The idea of showing people what I've been doing my entire life, essentially. And it's a dream come true to do these things that I had done in my living room when I was 7 and 8 years old, all the way up to being 20 years old, and I was on stage opening up for Public Enemy at BB King's Theater in Times Square. That was my first
wow.
like big show. So going from rapping in my house in front of my mom and sister when I'm 7, 8 years old, all the way up to opening for Public Enemy when I was 20, that was really invigorating and very inspiring. So I started to take it a little bit more seriously.
Yeah.
Um, but making songs was something that I didn't have much experience with. It was just kind of rapping for fun, a lot of freestyling, a lot of kind of making jokes. And then I got into songwriting and actually like crafting music in 2007, 2008. And I went to a lot of open mics, a lot of showcases in New York. And I made a bit of a name for myself, both freestyling and doing actual written songs. Um, and then this was during the blog era when you had a lot of bloggers who were kind of in control of the independent music scene.
Right.
And I somehow got in front of them, and I ended up getting kind of bounced around from blog to blog to blog. And it spread pretty organically. I had a few songs that got really popular in New York, and I was a part of a scene in New York City that was fervent and rich with artists. So I was surrounded by peers who were creating art constantly, who were, we were all going to festivals, touring, but it was all independent. And a few of us sometimes would pop, but above the surface, and some of us got signed by labels. But really, from 2008 to 2013, I was making music all around the city, going to festivals, putting out albums, and it was quite a good time.
It sounds amazing. And yeah, it feels like from just how you explained it, or described it rather, um, it w- it was the best time to be doing that. And that that's kind of why I personally admired hip hop when I was growing up as well, because compared to like a lot of the pop music and um, also the more established rock music, I quite liked indie rock as well because it was just like coming up. But I always felt like rap and hip hop was just very like true, like what you said really mattered. And like you said, the rhymes and puns and just like seeing how people how they use their skill to not what they say, but also how they say it in a funny, witty way. Um, and I actually haven't listened to a lot of too much of the new hip hop stuff because especially in Germany, I feel like now, and I don't know how it is in the States because I haven't listened for a while, but I feel like now rap and hip hop has just been established as something that also works. So there's a lot of people who just kind of um, do it because it is popular and don't really do it for the same reasons anymore. And don't just like you said, oh, it was just around us. It's just something we did. It's something that gave us a platform, and we just kind of went with it. Um, so yeah, I don't want to get into a whole rant again, but I feel like that's something that hip hop maybe has lost a little bit as well.
Yeah, um, just like any art form, it goes through evolutions and adaptations, and it changes. So I think that the way that rap was in the 80s, it made sense that it morphed into what it became in the 90s. And then from the 90s into the 2000s, not only did rap change, but music changed. And then from the 2000s into the 2010s, not only did music change, but the music industry changed, and all of
Mhm.
media really changed. So the streaming models and social media, the way that music ended up getting distributed, shifted completely. And I think that the music was going to naturally change as well. So lyricism being a vital component of rap in the 80s and 90s made sense because it was really part of a very word heavy movement. It was about
Right.
storytelling. It was about sharing the realities, like you said, the authenticity of the environments where a lot of these artists were living that most of the rest of the country, the rest of the world didn't even know about. Like NWA always said that they were basically journalists who were telling the
Yeah.
world what was going on in their area. And rap was really meant to be a verbal and linguistic based art form. But in the 2000s, it became more about jingles and commercialized selling merchandise essentially. And the money kind of changed the art form. And you still had rappers who took lyricism really seriously, but that was no longer the primary focal point of the genre. But people were still making great music. If you look at the early 2000s, there's still some amazing music that was being made in hip hop, but the shift was already happening. And then, you look at the early, 2010s, there was kind of a struggle going on between, well, who are we as rappers? Are we the people from the 90s? Because those guys were still around. Like the quote unquote goats were still making rap music.
Yeah.
But or are we this new breed of the 2010s? And it kind of went through an identity crisis. And then as the 2010s turned into the 2020s, the new up and coming rappers were no longer emulating the guys from the 80s and 90s. They were emulating the guys from the 2000s and 2010s. And then it continued to go in that direction. And I think it's going to continue to shift and change. I agree with you that I think it's hard to be somebody who grew up loving rap in the 80s and 90s and appreciate what's going on now, because it's so different and there's less to grab onto, lyrically, at least in hip hop on a mainstream level. But whatever made the underground great in the 80s and 90s is still happening nowadays. It's a little bit harder to find. And the irony of that is rich because there's so much music now and we have so much access to music. It should be easier to find it, but it's a
Mm.
saturated market and we've gotten inundated with everybody's a rapper now. So it's harder to find high quality independent music. But it's out there. And so I would recommend that people who love hip hop don't just listen to the same 200 songs that you've been listening to your entire life. There's new hip hop being made that's awesome and that will bring you right back to what you appreciated about the earlier art form. It's 2025. Don't you want to hear what young kids who are still great writers have to say about the world in 2025 through this genre? There's plenty to be heard. It's just not at the forefront of the genre like it used to be.
Um, Actually, funny enough, like a couple of weeks or maybe a month ago, one of my friends here in New Zealand, he showed me this rapper, and I don't know if I can pronounce her name right, but I think it was Dochi or something like that. She was
Mhm,
from Florida, and she,
mhm.
uh, like he said, listen to her album, and it was really, really good. It was like this old school LA kind of vibe, and like old school hip hop, but fusing it with the more modern sounds, and I really, really enjoyed it. So, um, yeah, just because I know how much I enjoyed it, do you actually maybe have some recommendations for newer artists to check out as
Sure,
well?
absolutely. So there's, a rapper named Premrock. I would recommend him very strongly. He has a colleague named Curly Castro. They're on a label called Backwoods Records. I would recommend all the artists on Backwoods.
Right.
Um, if you've never heard of Homeboy Sandman,
I
I
have
couldn't
not.
possibly recommend Homeboy Sandman any stronger. One of my favorite things to do in life is to put people onto Homeboy Sandman's music.
Right.
So definitely check him out. He's one of the most prolific artists ever. He puts out new content constantly, and he's been doing it for like 15 years. So he's somebody I would definitely check out with great enthusiasm. Um, and commercially, it's tricky because the rappers who are high up on the charts, these are guys who are making music that doesn't pertain to what I usually look for in hip hop. But there's plenty out there. There's a rapper named Kemba, Kemba, who I'd recommend. Um, he works, or actually, he went on tour for a while with a rapper named IDK. He's pretty great. Um, yeah, and I see that you're wearing a Mac Miller hoodie. R.I.P. Mac Miller.
Yes.
He has somehow a new album coming out a week from tomorrow. Oh no, a week from today. Sorry, it's next Friday. His album's coming out.
Oh, I that just made my day. I did not know that.
I'm
That's
glad to hear it. Yeah, it's
that's
it's
pretty cool.
unreleased material that I'm not sure exactly who in his camp has put this together, but it's coming out a week from today.
Oh, I loved his like Circles, the postmortem album. It was
Yep.
he was just going into such a musical direction late in his life. It was yeah. I can't wait to hear what that one will sound like.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting.
Um, so I don't know if that's kind of an unfair question, but you being a new father and obviously having this tutoring business and what it sounds to me like doing great work and you know why you're doing it. And that's the most important thing in anything that we do. Um, but do you ever see yourself, or I don't know if you maybe still are as a hobby, still pursuing music to some extent?
No. I wouldn't say never, but I'm not right now. I put out my last album about 12 years ago. Wow.
Right.
Yeah, 12 years ago. That's crazy. And I think I've maybe put out like 2 or 3 songs since then. Are you familiar with Gift of Gab? RIP Gift of Gab as well. He was a rapper in Black Alicious. You know Black Alicious? They're a
Yes.
pretty popular group. I did a song with him maybe
Mhm.
like 5 or 6 years ago. That was the most recent song that I put out. Um, no, I mean, I rap with my 8-month-old all the time.
Nice.
Um, he loves beatboxing, um, and we do a lot of silly songs together. But, aside from that, I haven't written any rhymes in a long time. But I don't refuse to. It's just not where my head has been for a while. I've been doing a lot of writing, but none of it rhymes. Um, but I feel very satiated with the art that I did make. I made a lot of songs. I made a lot of friends. I made a lot of memories. It was a very important part of my life, and it carried me through, the first 40 years basically, with great ardor and passion. And if the time comes where I get to do that again, I'd be happy to. But I haven't, and that's completely fine with me.
So, um, yeah, something I'm also interested in because I feel like I've heard it throughout the conversation every now and then as well. Um, is well, obviously, writing is a recurring theme because writing is important in rap lyrics. It's very important. Like you need um, a high skill of language and understanding of language. It is obviously very important in stand-up comedy and knowing how to say things, when to say them, and what timing to say them. Um, so you just said you still do some writing. What yeah, so basically my one question is what importance does writing have in your life? And then also obviously I want to know how it looks at the moment, how writing is in your life at the moment.
Great question. So I've always viewed writing as an extension of thought and as a relative of speech. So although I'm a tutor and I'm an educator, I really think my job is to be a communicator. And my interest and ability in delivering messages in a way that lands and that hopefully has some sort of resonance or impact isn't relegated exclusively to the spoken word. I also like putting it down in the way that somebody who I'm not talking to in the moment or isn't listening to a recording of me would be able to appreciate as well. So I published an essay a few years ago about postmodernism and how the philosophy of postmodernism hinders learning. There's been a bit of a resurgence in a postmodern mode of thinking in the States, at least culturally, the last
Yeah.
15 years. And I've noticed that it has impacted my students. So I wrote an essay about the detriments of postmodernism in education. I wrote a book about executive functioning
Yeah.
um, that is meant to be a guide for educators or parents or students of any age about learning how to learn. That's really what executive functioning comes down to in a lot of ways is gaining skills that help us be in a position where we can be capable and functional learners. And I wrote a memoir um, about 10 years ago uh, called A View of You. That's a view of you, a view of you. Um, that was really an exploration into the meaning of objective reality, through the lens of me telling the story of the first 20 years of my life. Um, so those are pieces of writing that I've done that don't rhyme.
Right. The the more I listen to your stories, I have a feeling like we could do a whole hour probably just talking about philosophy as well. I mean, it is what you studied for, but it really to me shines through in everything you say that you um just are very observant and you really like um yeah, you like to think about things as I believe everyone should, and you just yeah, it's um those memoirs just sounded very interesting to me. I feel like maybe I will go and find them and read them um because
I appreciate you saying so. Yeah. I decided not to publish that book.
oh
So I don't think you'd be able to find it online anywhere. Um, it really began as a personal exploration for my own well-being. It was a way for me to kind of ground myself. And the more that I wrote, the more I recognized that I actually had a book in me that I wanted to organize properly. And the narrative was intertwined with a lot of philosophical musings, but not of the moment. Really, it was the philosophical musings that I happened to come up with as a kid. So the memoir is really just of my life up to the age of 20, and it entails a lot of what I viewed to be, to quote Karis one, my philosophy at the time. So it's interesting for me to look back on it now, which I don't do, but it would be
r-
interesting because it is the story of my childhood, but I wrote it 10 years ago. So my voice from 10 years ago is quite prominent as well. Um, it exists. Maybe I'll do something with it someday to get it out into the world. But yeah, there's a copy of it back there amongst all those rectangles somewhere.
right.
Um, yeah, it's heavy. I'll be honest with you. It's a heavy piece of writing.
um I feel like that's a beautiful thing about written art as well, like you said, is that we can go back to it, and especially something we have written ourselves, and kind of because I talked about observing things and then also observing ourselves, observing our own thoughts and voices. You said 10 years ago or 20 years ago at some point, maybe, and um, just seeing I mean, this is a whole nother thing. This different human or the same human, however you want to view it. Are we the same person? Are we a different person? And that's why I really, really love and encourage people to be creative like that and just put things out. Because you can only create the art you would create at this point. At this point, because in 20 years you're gonna be creating different art.
That's definitely true. Even a journal. It doesn't have to be something that is wholly of your own imagination. It could just really be saying what you think and feel and do in the moment. You go back and look at that in 5 years and 10 years and 20 years, you're going to learn something about where you were at that time. And it can really help us in the moment to understand where we are now, to look back and see what we went through. A lot of times we have kind of a highlight reel in our minds of these more prominent moments, more prominent experiences or feelings that we had. But very often the context, the sequence gets lost. And to go back and be able to say, like, oh, so when I experienced this thing, that was just 2 weeks after I had experienced that. And then just 3 days later, this happened. And the whole time this was going on. And this was like during this like cultural moment or historical moment. Because very
Right.
often we don't know that we're a part of a cultural or historical moment until later we look back and we're like, "Oh my gosh, the whole time that I was going through this, it was when the Berlin Wall was going down." Or it was, it was 10 days after 9/11 when, like, this happened, and, like, I was already past it. I wasn't thinking about it anymore. I was just living my life. Um, the idea of journaling, I think, is one that we we don't value enough, because not only is it useful in the moment, it can really be quite edifying in the future to look back. It helps us kinda see our own story in a lot of ways.
Yes. Um, yeah, that's a funny thing because I feel like the theme and topic of journaling comes up in my life a lot in the last month. So I really feel like I personally should get started with it.
Yeah.
Um, but
Or just do talk to text, or just keep a verbal journal. There's a lot of ways nowadays. We don't have to sit down with a pen and paper and say "Dear Diary" or even typing it. There's a lot of ways that we can just kind of share with some recording medium what's happening, and then just hit stop, and then come back to it later. It's worth looking at, I think.
yeah, I feel like it really helps in the topics that we discussed in the beginning as well of just finding your purpose, finding the things you find enjoyment in, and just basically making sure that you also record things happening in your life and maybe not just um, lead a reactive life, but should be more in charge of like doing things purposeful.
Yeah. Meditation is great for that. Um, People are talking about keeping, like, appreciation journals, or whatever it might be, and I don't think it has to get all that focused on specific ideas. I say just sit down and in some way record what you're thinking, feeling, and doing, and don't try and be impressive, don't try and make it good. It doesn't have to be special or anything like that. It's useful. Get out of your own head a little bit.
Definitely. Well, I love that we had that topic in there as well and had some nice tips there as well, and also for myself, again, selfish. Um, but overall, Jesse, I think we've covered a lot of things. I'm very happy with the conversation. Lot of interesting topics. Very thankful for the tips of artists. I'm definitely gonna check them out. And
Right.
yeah, um, so I think it's a good place for us to wrap it up. If lastly you just want to tell the people if anything we talked about at all resonated with them, where can they find out more about you, more about your tutoring, and all the links I'll put in the description as well so they can easily find it. But yeah, where can we find you online?
Sure. So the name of my company is Hartman Tutoring. That's Hartman. So you can find everything you need to find at hartmantutoring.com. You can see all the services we provide, how we do things. Contact info is there as well. Feel free to check it out. And you can find some of my writing at jesseahartman.com.
Wonderful. Um, So yeah, Jesse, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for sharing your journey and all those valuable insights with us. I really enjoyed it. Was it good?
I appreciate you having me. Thanks very much. I enjoyed it too.
Nice. All right. Goodbye, everyone.